Oh boy. How do you even describe this? Like, did you ever want to read a comic that uses real-life images of children that Sonic the Hedgehog would pull into a video game world? No? Well, anyways, here's Sonic Live. And if this cover art is anything to go off of, with Sonic's eyes facing in two opposite directions while he abducts children with arms the size of Sonic's hands, well, you just know that you're in for a really trippy ride. The story starts off with Robotnik calling out Sonic to fight one last time man to man, or rather man-bot to hedgehog as the doctor puts it. Sonic zooms in without saying a word and kicks down a door. This then prompts Dr. Robotnik to make a sexist joke. Women, am I right? This is how we also know that Dr. Robotnik isn't Eggman, because Eggman, as we all know, is a feminist. Anyways, Sally has this device on her head that doesn't allow her to talk or think, which honestly is pretty terrifying when you think about it. Sonic gets ready to fight, but Eggman has a bunch of SWAT bots who fire onto Sonic and Sonic dies. Eggman laughs over Sonic's disintegrated corpse, and this SWAT bot just stands there ready to fist bump Robotnik, praying that he won't be left hanging. So as it turns out, Sonic isn't technically dead, because this is all just a video game. You know, one of those Archie Sonic video game tie-ins that you play with a TV remote, and when you lose, it shuts off your TV for you. Here we meet Steve and Jesse, and I'm gonna be real here, these photos of like real life children make me really uncomfortable. With the exception of this creepy ghost hand in the TV, I feel like I'm just creeping through some stranger's family photos, and that these kids really shouldn't just be exposed to the public. It's weird, right? To see like real life kids that you don't know in these family photo settings. So that creepo ghost hand, as it turns out, is actually Sonic, who's trapped in this empty green void that he floats around in, desperately lost. Now meanwhile, Robotnik doesn't take that brainsucker helmet off of Sally, and it's kind of confusing because if this is a video game, like, isn't the video game over, or would it reset or whatever? Or does it just keep going in this world? I'm not totally sure, but Robotnik doesn't take the brainsucker helmet off of Sally, and instead he puts her in a jail where it's shown that not only does Tails have a comb over, but he's also been captured with Rotor. Meanwhile, back in the void, Sonic hears a voice announcing that they've just arrived home from school. Could this be God? Well, Sonic peers into the green speck and holy what the heck is this sleep paralysis demon staring back into my soul? These are those real life kids from the start, Steve and Jesse, and if there was ever any reason for why you shouldn't use a more realistic art style to draw humans next to Sonic, this right here would be it. Sonic reaches out to those kids and pulls them right into the TV, where they get to meet Sonic in the in-between zone. That's actually what it's called, and it shows a level of creativity like none other. Sonic and these children that he just met walk hand in hand into the void, hoping to find their way into this video game world. Now, Robotnik, meanwhile, is about to send these freedom fighters into orbit via a rocket ship when suddenly Sonic and these children come crashing in from the void. Sonic beats up some robots and then probably realizes a fatal flaw in his plan, which is that it's a bad idea to take children into a fight against killer robots. I'm seriously a little bit perplexed about what Sonic's plan was in regards to how these children were going to help, but I mean, whatever. Sonic frees these kids from the SWAT bots, and then probably yanks their arms right out of their sockets as he runs as fast as he can towards a rocket control room. Sonic takes a wild guess and presses the only orange button next to a bunch of blue buttons, which kills the rockets, and these kids just continue to make me feel uncomfortable all the while. Sonic is just so big next to them. It's kind of jarring, and these poor kids really should have been stylized with a more cartoony look to them, because man, these faces are just uncanny valley material, like it's like Sid from Toy Story if he was drawn. Once out of the rocket control room, a purple and neon green light sucks up Sonic and his kidnapped kids, and they find themselves in front of Robotnik back in that video game level from before. Now, quick pause on the story here, but there's two things that I just want to point out really fast. First, it's that I absolutely hate the way that Sonic's back looks here. It looks like a bumpy, mighty armadillo, but like the real thing that I want to talk about with Steve and Jesse, they actually look good. I like this more simplistic cartoon style that they went with on this panel, and I wish that we got to see more of this earlier. It's also a really cute Speed Racer reference that they end up making, but of course they call him Speed Rider because, you know, they don't own Speed Racer. So again, Robotnik surrounds Sonic with SWAT bots, and Sonic is like, "You couldn't have come up with this all by yourself, Doctor." And Sonic come up with what? This is literally how the story started, in this exact area where you were surrounded by SWAT bots. It's not really anything that innovative from what we've seen so far. However, instead of shooting Sonic, Robotnik instead takes Sonic and these children into the building where he shows that he has several Robotniks working on a statue of a buff Robotnik. This shows that the dude will do anything in his ability to make himself look good except actually get on a treadmill. Turns out that Stevie understands that these guys are from multiple parallel universes thanks to a show called Space Trek. And you know what? Forget every complaint I had. I love all of these silly little references to real-life TV shows. Unfortunately, we don't get a ton of those, and instead the group just gets thrown into prison and we don't get to hear more about Space Trek. Now, while in prison, Sonic would meet Maury and Jerry. Who are Maury and Jerry, you might ask? Well, get ready for a little bit of confusion. So basically, someone at Archie clearly thought that these Western kids wouldn't understand Japanese names, and so Maury and Jerry are Sonic's video game creators in the Archie Sonic world. This means that the real-life world in this comic isn't actually our world, but rather another parallel universe to this one, in which two white businessmen created Sonic the Hedgehog based on a sketch of an unnamed artist, which is presumably Yuji Naka, who is Sonic's actual creator in our world. And Yuji Naka, or this unnamed artist, drew Sonic based on a creature that he saw in a trans-dimensional receiver that they were also working on alongside with the video game. So not only is Sonic created by these two random white guys, but also these two guys have a business where not only do they make Sonic the Hedgehog video games, but they also make machines that can get transmissions from other dimensions, including the one that Sonic lives in. What? Anyway, Robotnik has been up and betrayed by the other Robotniks, and Snively gets his first speaking role in this comic. Good for you, Snively. Robotnik then shows up at the cell door and blows it up, freeing everyone inside, but then it's shown that this isn't Robotnik. No, this is actually a woman with a lazy eye who is actually a mascot, and she's wearing a hyper-realistic Robotnik suit. Turns out to stop this evil Robotnik machine, they have to enter a code on a Sega controller, and full transparency, that's cute as heck. I love this kind of stuff. Steve knows the code to save the day, and it's some kind of butchered Konami code from what I can tell. I don't actually know if this code actually comes from any video game. It's a little bit before my time, if I'm totally honest, and it doesn't sound like the Konami code that I know and that I've used in the past. But I'd love to hear if you know anything in the comments about this. Now, with that though, the robots are all destroyed. Jessie rubs her head against Sonic's singular giant eyeball, and then the kids tearfully hug Sonic goodbye as Sonic makes this weirdly uncomfortable face towards the reader like he's getting some weird pleasure out of these crying kids.
Why is he smiling? What does he know?
The kids get sent back to their real world, and everyone is saved in the end. This is actually only the halfway point in this comic, but nothing else in this comic actually has anything to do with Sonic Live, although Knuckles does fight this thing that he calls a blood beast, which clearly looks like it took inspiration from displacement beasts from D&D, and I mean, that's just a crazy cool thing that I wasn't expecting to see today. And yeah, that was basically Sonic Live. I know that there's those two other stories in the comic book, but they really don't have anything to do with this story at all. And I'll be honest, the part of the story that we saw is a pretty wild trip, but also it's kind of a cute story, and I could see how little kids would actually really enjoy this. Not to the point where Ken Penders made the argument that kids would actually enjoy this more than the Sonic the Hedgehog movie that came out a little while back, but I could see kids thinking that this is fun. The art was, well, let's put it simply, pretty off-putting when it started, but with the sudden change in style at the midway point, it looks like they kind of realized that it was kind of weird as well, and they made the right call to make them much more cartoony and easier on the eyes, probably also easier on the artist to draw. Now, before we close off, I actually do have this kind of really fun fact, which is that Steve and Jessie were actually based on Ken Penders' son Steve and his niece Jessie, which, let's be real, totally awesome. All opinions on Ken Penders aside, I think it's super cool that he put his family into the comics. I think the real life family pictures are kind of weird, but overall the general idea of being a kid and being inside of a Sonic comic must have been so freaking cool. I know that I would have been stoked as a kid to have an opportunity like that. Heck, I'm 26 and I would have enjoyed having an opportunity like that. Now, if only everything else that Ken Penders did was kind of cool. One other little fun fact too that I read online, and honestly who knows about the validity because this comic is quite old in and of itself, but the reason that Steve at the beginning is using a TV remote instead of a Sega controller is because Ken had originally taken the photos at his house where they had a Sega system to actually work with, but for whatever reason those photos weren't going to work out and they had to retake the photos in a pretty short amount of time. But Ken was at his niece's parents' house at the time, and they didn't own any video game consoles, so they had to make do with the TV remote. Honestly, it looks funny, but it works. Like, if you weren't looking for it, you would maybe even miss it on the smaller pages of a comic book. It's fun. I like it. So, was this a good comic? No, not by a long shot, but yeah, it's a fun little story, and it's definitely one of the weirder ones that I've looked at. Out of probably any comic book, I can't think of anything that really incorporates real life characters like that, like the writer's son into the story with like these actual photos. It's honestly probably some of my favorite work by Ken Penders. It's creative, which I really enjoy seeing, and also, yeah, it's a fun little story. It's nothing too deep, and I think that lends itself really well to Ken Penders, who I find often has a really hard time laying a ton of like groundwork down for these massive spanning stories, and I think being stuck in this kind of one-shot story really just allowed him to put everything into one story without being like, check out what happens in Knuckles the Echidna to see what happens to these kids next. And that there is the end of the video. If you enjoyed it and feel like I deserved any kind of like, subscribe, or whatever, feel free to do so, but of course don't feel obliged to do it. I just hope that you have a good one. Hate the way that Sonic's back looks here. It looks like a backy mighty it looks like a bumpy Marty oh my god.